Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to my journey across the United States where every state has a story. Today we're covering the lore of Mississippi, a place steeped in strangeness. From whispers of a Civil War era zombie outbreak to nukes detonated underground to machines that seem to strangely stay in motion, you won't want to miss this one. Now, before we jump into the story, I have a quick favor to ask. If you enjoy these deep dives into America's strangest tales, commenting, liking the video, and hitting that subscribe button will help me a ton as I struggle my way towards 100,000 subs in 2025. This will never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyways, with that, let's get into Mississippi's weird lore. Okay, so I'm not necessarily saying you should take this one seriously, but if you dig into the history of Warren County, Mississippi, and in particular if you take a close look at the siege of Vicksburg, you're going to find an odd tale woven into it. Something that some say is absolutely nonsense, and something that others say may have actually happened. To start, let's describe the siege of Vicksburg. This event took place in the summer of 1863. Union General Ulysses S. Grant was very determined to take Vicksburg, Mississippi. And why was that? Because Vicksburg was basically the Confederacy's last big stronghold on the Mississippi River. Controlling it meant the Union could split the Confederacy in two. The siege officially kicked off on May 18th of 1863, after Grant tried and failed a bunch more dramatic tactics, including digging canals and launching a bunch of weird, swampy flanking maneuvers. But finally he said, you know what, let's just camp outside and wait him out. So for 47 days, the Union Army surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and bombarding it non-stop. Inside of Vicksburg, it was not very kawaii. The civilians and Confederate soldiers were holed up in caves, eating rats and mules. They were like, any day now, surely help is coming. Spoiler though, it was not coming. Now, on July 4th of 1863, Confederate General John C. Pemberton surrendered, probably because everyone inside Vicksburg was about 5 minutes from chewing on shoe leather. The Union ended up taking about 4,800 casualties, while the Confederacy lost around 3,300 during the siege. But over 29,000 soldiers surrendered, which was a huge chunk of the Southern Army. The significance of this engagement was huge, like changing the course of the war huge. Combined with the Union victory at Gettysburg, which happened literally the day before, the fall of Vicksburg was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Lincoln actually called it the key to victory, and honestly, he wasn't wrong. But the thing is, wrapped up alongside this tale is another. Apparently, and this isn't exactly verifiable, but there are whispers that in the midst of this siege on Vicksburg on June 17th, the city residents of Vicksburg spotted something strange. At first, it was someone who was stumbling about in a way that didn't seem normal. He was keenly unaware of his surroundings, and upon seeing some of the civilians, slowly started stumbling towards them, unable to communicate and grasping at them, biting even. Sadly, they just assumed this man may have had a head injury, and he was too far gone, and some Confederate soldiers did away with him. But the thing is, he wasn't the only person exhibiting this behavior. Over the course of the siege, in addition to having no supplies and, being besieged, it's claimed that multiple times per day, apparently deceased Confederate soldiers could be seen walking with a limp slowly through the town, and that they'd walk towards their ex-compatriots and civilians alike, biting at them and trying to eat them. Heck, Union forces upon entering the city in July actually also encountered these individuals that were seemingly the undead. Some even claim thousands of these things were put down at the siege of Vicksburg, many of which were wearing Confederate uniforms. Now, as for what this was, it's scarcely, and I mean scarcely, documented at all. The only actual record I could dig up of this was an account in an old newspaper of the event that said, I quote, "When we entered Vicksburg, many of the Southern Army surrendered, yet among their ranks were soldiers who appeared dead yet still wanted a fight. These soldiers did not pick up their rifles. Rather, they were more content with ripping flesh from our bones." Now, I could find a perhaps made-up newspaper article saying this, but I actually couldn't find any record of the Jackson Tribune from Jackson, Mississippi, which was the newspaper that this article supposedly came from. So anyways, that's the lore. And it says that supposedly, maybe during the Civil War, there were bona fide zombies roaming the streets of Vicksburg. As for where they came from, no light is ever shed, and hardly any mention of this can even be found online. So anyways, hey, let me know if you've too heard this legend. It's certainly a fun one, at least. In Pascagoula, Mississippi, right there on the Gulf Coast, there's admittedly a lot of lore going on, but usually, in modern day, it's known for being a little bit sleepy. And back in the 70s, this was also the case. Back in the day, there was also a little bit of drama between Native Americans and conquistadors, but otherwise it was a pretty mundane place. But in the fall of 1973, Pascagoula went from nothing much happening to wait, did you just say aliens? And it all started with two guys out for a night of fishing. It was October 11th of 1973. The air had that crisp, fall is here vibe. It was cool with a light breeze and a full moon lighting up the water. 43-year-old Charles Hickson, a factory worker, and his 19-year-old buddy Calvin Parker, someone he'd taken under his wing at work, decided to hit up their usual fishing spot by a run-down shipyard on the west bank of the Pascagoula River. Now, it wasn't the most glamorous place, but it was quiet, private, and perfect for a good evening of fishing. Until things took a strange turn. They'd only been casting their lines for about half an hour when they spotted a strange pulsing blue light coming from upstream. At first, they thought it was a cop, probably checking up on them because they were, well, technically trespassing on private property. Apparently, they'd done this before, fishing here, and had gotten warnings from police officers in the past for fishing here. But as it got closer, they realized this wasn't any patrol car. Nope, this was something otherworldly. Something flying in the air, actually. Out of nowhere, an aircraft, oval-shaped, about 30 feet wide, floated towards them. There were two flashing lights on either side, and a bright beam of light, which shone on the pair of men, and a strange whirring noise that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. Charles and Calvin couldn't even look at each other, let alone move after being hit with this beam of light. They were frozen, paralyzed, like someone just hit the pause button on their lives. And as the craft hovered in front of them over the water, they saw a hatch opened, and out of it came three beings. Now, these weren't your typical Hollywood aliens with big eyes and slimy gray skin. Oh no, these guys were kind of weird. Their original account claimed they were 6 feet tall, but they had crab-like claws, and they were all decked out in metallic suits. And I kid you not, they were buzzing and emitting a whirring noise just like their ship, sort of like an old broken vacuum cleaner that gained sentience. It's worth noting, by the account of Calvin, they were 4 to 4.5 feet in height, and sort of stocky builds like football players, so this diverges from Charles's account. Apparently, whatever they were, they just floated over to Charles and Calvin. They didn't walk, they floated, like gravity didn't even exist. 1 second they're standing there, like two guys just trying to fish, and the next they're weightless, being lifted off the ground, calm but completely confused. Charles and Calvin were floated aboard the craft, and everything at least went blank at first. Apparently later on during their interviews, they would remember more details. When they woke up, they were back on the pier, and the craft was gone. They checked their watches, and surprise, only about 20 minutes had passed, but the world around them seemed so off. So naturally, they did what any confused, freaked out Mississippian would do. They called Kessler Air Force Base in Biloxi. The response, yeah, sure guys, whatever you say. So they didn't believe them. Feeling a little less than reassured, they went to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office next. The deputies were, well, skeptical. In fact, the sheriff, once he arrived, was apparently initially pretty sure they were drunk. I mean, Charles even admitted he'd had a little whiskey after the abduction, but hey, who can blame them? If you got snatched by a UFO, you'd probably reach for the bottle too. Now here's where it gets good. The sheriff, suspecting the whole thing was a wild story, decided to step out for a break, but he left the cameras and the tape recorders rolling in the interview room. He was hoping to catch them slipping. Maybe hear them admitting it was all a hoax while the sheriff was out of the room. But instead, Charles and Calvin spoke, their voices full of terror. No jokes, no exaggeration, just pure raw fear. Calvin even blurted out, "I sure as hell almost had a heart attack. God, I ain't lying to you. I came 1 inch from dying." Charles sounded just as shaken and responded, "Jesus Christ, son, it scared me to death too." So the sheriff, who was now clearly intrigued, interviewed them separately, hoping for some inconsistency in their story. But no, according to the sheriff, everything lined up pretty well. Even Charles had some physical evidence, marks on his skin that looked like a needle had been jabbed into him. Both men described the beings in detail, and let me tell you what, These guys did not look like your typical sci-fi creatures. They apparently had no faces, just slits where their mouths should be, and they looked almost robotic. Kind of creepy, right? This is all in addition to them basically being mechanical beings. But the fun doesn't stop there. Charles kept remembering more details about the event, and this time he was talking about being strapped to an examination table aboard the UFO. He was scanned with some weird device, then a feminine creature appeared, and it was different from the robot aliens. More humanoid, but still a little bit unsettling. This one apparently spoke to Charles telepathically, assuring him that he wasn't in danger. And apparently she even pinched his cheek and poked around in his mouth. And by poke, I mean she went really deep, really deep. She grabbed his little ding-a-ling in the back of his throat, and I'll let you imagine the rest. There were also some probes involved in some accounts, but let's not get into this. This is a family-friendly channel. Meanwhile, Calvin wasn't having such a chill time. While Charles was getting his mouth examined by the kinda cute alien, Calvin was being mind probed by the mechanical aliens. No physical touch, just extraction of his thoughts. The whole time, he also noticed strange hieroglyphic-like symbols projected into the air from consoles on the craft, and he noted that he felt the craft was communicating with them or perhaps watching them. At one point, Charles saw visions, memories of past abductees. The female alien was apparently trying to tell him something important, but before he could fully understand, his memory went blank. Then, just like that, they were dropped back off on the pier like a cosmic Uber ride with a one-star driver. Now, no surprise here, police can't arrest aliens, so all the sheriff could do was listen to their wild story and advise them to keep quiet because they sounded insane. But Charles Hickson had other plans. Over the next few months, he started telling everyone and their grandmother about his encounter. He was interviewed by ufologists, went on TV, wrote books, and made money. Lots of money. Off the whole thing. And by the way, he kept doubling down on his story, never once backing off. Calvin, on the other hand, was more tight-lipped about the whole ordeal. It wasn't until about the 90s that he even wrote a book. But when he did, he admitted after some hypnosis sessions that more memories had come flooding back. Strange stuff. But here's the thing that makes this story a little harder to dismiss. There are other people that saw weird stuff this night too. There were reports of strange lights in the sky. And one couple even saw a blue light just above the water, drifting back and forth. They later claimed to see someone in the water, just watching them. So with this story behind us, what do I think happened? The truth is, I'm not really sure. On one hand, we have two witnesses who, for the better part of 30 years, while they were both alive, never once wavered in their stories. On the other hand, the story continues to grow over the years, and they wrote books, made appearances at conferences, and engaged in a long list of other for-profit activities. Things that make you wonder if perhaps this could have been crafted as a get-rich-quick scheme that really sort of worked. On the other hand, they may have absolutely experienced this, but I wonder if this could have been a hallucination. That being said, for these two individuals, Charles and Calvin, to have the same hallucination and share the same story after the fact, well, that would be pretty remarkable. That is, unless we hark back to the original explanations laid out by Calvin Parker in particular. Remember, he at the police station would originally say he was asleep throughout the whole incident, and it was only later that these memories flooded back to him. Also, let's keep in mind, Charles was older than Calvin, and he was his authority figure at work. I wonder, perhaps, if Calvin could have been coerced into sharing these stories. It was really only 20 years later that Calvin began sharing his own details of the supposed encounter. All of this said, it is documented that Calvin had multiple hospital stays following this incident related to stress he was undergoing. Whether this stress is related to lying about an alien abduction or an actual alien abduction, who's to say? Anyways, that's the story of the Pascagoula alien abduction case, one of the more famous cases of extraterrestrial visitation and abduction in recent history. So what do you think about it? In your eyes, is this all a case of hallucinations and Hawk Tuah-style money grabs, or do you think these two really saw something miraculous in the skies of Mississippi and were taken by it? You know where to tell me. So, the Pascagoula River flows right through the town of the same name, the one we just talked about, way down in southern Mississippi. That's not too far from where the mighty Mississippi River spills into the Gulf. Now, there's something I didn't mention on our last little segment regarding the UFO encounter that happened here. It's that this river sings, too. Yep, you heard that right. People for hundreds of years have reported strange melodic humming sounds floating over the water. Some say it's music, others say it's voices. A few probably just blame the cicadas. But me, I think it could be something deeper. Now, this hum doesn't happen all the time, just in certain spots under the right conditions, usually late at night when the fog rolls in and the water's still. It's like the river's remembering something. See, long before Mississippi had state lines and waffle houses, this land was home to the Pascagoula people, whose name in Choctaw language actually means bread eaters. No judgment, I'd follow the bread too. They shared this area with a neighboring tribe, the Biloxi, and for a time things were peaceful. But as stories go, especially ones involving love, when pride and protocol get in the way, drama unfolds. So here's where the river turns from just a cool body of water to a living, breathing legend. Altama, the chief of the Pascagoula, was said to have fallen in love with Enola, a princess of the Biloxi. Sounds sweet, right? Well, the problem is, Enola had already been promised to the Biloxi chief. Whoops! Despite this, Enola decided she'd rather follow her heart than follow the rules, and she ran off to live with Altama and the Pascagoula. As you can probably guess, the Biloxi were not about to let that fly. War drums started to beat. The Biloxi, outnumbering the Pascagoula, decided they would do away with them or make them their slaves. Faced with an attack they couldn't win and unwilling to be enslaved by their enemies, the Pascagoula made a heart-wrenching choice in the face of certain defeat. Rather than fight and fall, they chose to walk hand in hand into the river, singing a death song as they went. One by one, they stepped into the waters, voices rising until the river swallowed them up whole. Their song, the last thing the living heard. Thus, some folks say that's the humming you hear to this day, the whispers of a lost people rising from the depths. Now, just when you think you've got the story pegged, here comes Governor Perrier of French Louisiana, back in the 1700s, showing up to see what all the fuss is about. Also, I assume he's not what the sparkling water is named after, but who knows. This guy goes down to the mouth of the Pascagoula with some missionaries and natives, and what does he see here? Apparently a column of foaming water was rising up out of it, and on top of it was a mermaid. Not a little one with a dinglehopper, a full-on siren singing, "Come to me, come to me." Apparently some of the native folks and even some missionaries with the governor walked straight into the water and vanished following this creature's direction. Like poof, gone. And this isn't just a Pascagoula thing. Similar stories pop up in other places in the region, like Muscle Shoals, Alabama, where strange sounds in the water come with tales of disappearances and sirens. Coincidence? You tell me, but this region seems like it may be a little prone to mermaids. Some even say that the nearby Yazoo River has its own mermaid, a tale that sometimes in my readings gets intertwined with this one of the Singing River and sirens. This tale essentially tells of a beautiful young woman who fell in love with a man who went up and down the Yazoo, or sometimes the Pascagoula by ferry, and that when he was gone, she'd wait for days for his return, only to be smitten every time he arrived. But one day he didn't arrive, and nobody had the heart to tell her what happened. Therefore, it said this woman, for days, then months, ran up and down the river looking for her lost love, before one day she decided to plunge herself into the river. But instead of drowning like she'd hoped, she instead began to develop strange features. Legs that fused together, scales, and then her face twisted into something kind of vengeful. She became the Yazoo, or perhaps the Pascagoula, mermaid. And to this day, folks sometimes report seeing the figure of a human at night gliding below the river's surface, often accompanied by the sounds of a woman singing ghostly tunes in the dead of night. So as we always do, we've got to consider what the folks, admittedly folks like me, that wear lab coats and khakis say about these legends. And they'll tell you that the sounds probably actually come from underwater acoustics, maybe the way water flows over the rocks or through hidden vegetation, creating natural vibrations that hum through the riverbed. Others think it's an auditory illusion, maybe the buzzing of insects or winds through the reeds getting reflected off of the water just right. Admittedly, they might be onto something, given this happens in other parts of the world too. That makes sense, but it's a little less magical, isn't it? So, sadly, or perhaps amazingly, the truth is nobody knows for sure what's creating these noises. Whether it's the echoes of a doomed love story, the song of mermaids, or just the river talking to herself. Regardless, the singing river has become a source of local pride. You'll find businesses named after it, art inspired by it, and curious visitors coming from all over just to hear it whisper. So tell me, have you heard this river singing? Or maybe you've even seen a mermaid here yourself. Personally, I'd love to visit this place. I bet it'd be a treat. Gather round, folks, for a tale that's part history, part absurdity, and all camel. It's not an average Civil War story, but rather a story that will take us back to Vicksburg and will tell us about the saga of the one and only Confederate camel, who in a stroke of historical randomness became a literal and figurative hump in the middle of the war. First things first, Douglas wasn't your run-of-the-mill Civil War mascot. No sir, he was a domesticated dromedary, which, for the uninitiated, is a camel with a single hump. Old Douglas, as they sometimes called him, was essentially the MVP of the Confederate 43rd Mississippi Infantry, which, because of this strange companion, earned them the name the Camel Regiment. First things first, let's ask the question, how did Old Douglas end up being a part of the 43rd Mississippi? Well, there's a bit of a debate about this, but in general, there are two pathways. One of the ways he's thought to have joined this group is through the Texas Camel Experiment and the subsequent U.S. Camel Corps. See, I've talked about this before, but during the 1850s, the U.S. government launched the infamous Texas Camel Experiment, a scheme to import camels to help with military exploration out west, because, as anyone who's ever tried to get a horse across a desert will tell you, camels need less water and are just plain more efficient. The second possible pathway is that the U.S. was also known to play mad scientist with camels in the southeast for agricultural purposes. For instance, some savvy plantation owners down in Mobile, Alabama and Mississippi were actually having these creatures imported, and some think that this is how Douglas managed to get scooped up by William Hargrove, who eventually gave him to Colonel W.H. Moore of the 43rd Mississippi. And boom, Douglas suddenly went from being a camel to a war camel, where he was put to work carrying various instruments and knapsacks. So again, as we discussed in my Urban Legends That Were True video, these soldiers tried to treat Old Douglas like a horse. But as we know, camels are a heck of a lot more feisty. He was known to break free of any tether and would sometimes react aggressively to any attempt to restrain him. Eventually, the soldiers got smart. Instead of trying to keep him in line, they just let him roam free and graze in the vicinity of the regiment. Luckily, he wasn't exactly a solitary grazer, and he never wandered off too far. He was always within shouting distance of whoever was holding the food. That was a smart camel. The only real problem they had with him once they figured out you couldn't tie him up is that Douglas was known to be a poor playmate to the regiment's horses. You'd think that in the chaos of war, maybe the horses and camels would learn to coexist, but no, Douglas and the horses hated each other. Horses, understandably, were scared of him, and Douglas, let's just say he didn't win any popularity contest among his four-legged friends. There's at least one account where the camel started a stampede that left a couple of horses not alive. So yeah, not exactly a fan favorite. Still, Douglas wasn't just a mascot. He was in the thick of it. He saw action during some of the big Civil War battles, like the Lucca Campaign and the Battle of Corinth in 1862. In both cases, the Confederacy lost, and it was clear to anyone with half a brain that the Union was taking control of key strategic locations, and that meant more railroads for them and fewer places for Confederates to get their supplies. So what does that mean for our noble camel? It means Douglas was pretty damn uncomfortable, just like the rest of the Confederate soldiers, but Douglas persisted. And then there was the end. As the siege of Vicksburg unfolded, it was clear that things were going south for the Confederates, no pun intended. Supplies were blocked, morale was tanking, and Douglas, our loyal wandering camel, made the mistake of wandering a little too far from his Confederate handlers. One day he wandered right into no man's land, the area between the Union and Confederate lines, and well, let's just say the Union sharpshooters didn't recognize him as a prisoner of war. Instead, they saw a target and took him out. It's said that Douglas's death sent the 43rd Mississippi into a rage. They swore vengeance for their fallen friend. According to some versions of the story, which are admittedly a little shaky, Colonel Robert S. Bevier sent 6 of his best Confederate snipers to hunt down and take out the Union sharpshooter who took down their camel, and these snipers were successful. And apparently the colonel didn't even want to say the man's name afterwards. That's certainly a really nice story, but let's be real here, there's a possibility that this story was just a story, and in reality the end of Old Douglas was more about a bunch of famished soldiers just deciding to eat the camel instead of avenging him. And I mean, he was a huge camel and things were tough. You can't really blame them a lot for this desperation. Now, regardless of how Old Douglas passed, he is now a Civil War legend. His grave sits in Cedar Hill Cemetery in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and today you can visit his grave and pay respects to the only camel ever to participate in a major American war, to my knowledge at least. His tombstone naturally has a camel etched onto it, because, well, how could it not? You won't miss it, I promise. In modern times, an organization named the Texas Camel Corps loves to spread the tales of Douglas and other camels from the Civil War era, reminding us that sometimes the weirdest chapters in history are the most entertaining. They've made it their mission to keep the story of these camels alive and well, though hopefully they aren't trying to reenact the whole revenge sniper thing. That would be a bit much. And so Douglas the camel, whose life was marked by both chaos and a weird kind of heroism, lives on in history, not as a war hero per se, but as a creature of pure, unadulterated Civil War absurdity. Long live the hump. Off of the Natchez Trace Parkway at milepost 233.2, just south of Tupelo, Mississippi, you'll find a quaint little stop that is somehow steeped in folklore. For most, this is just a spot with some bathrooms, picnic tables, and a bit of hiking with trails connecting through the nearby national forest. But for people like you and me, those weirder folks, this place is a lot more fun. On this property, you'll find a sign titled Witch Dance, and inscribed upon this sign, you'll read, Witch Dance. The very name conjures visions of eerie midnights, swirling black capes, and brooms stacked against a nearby tree. The old folks say the witches once gathered here to dance, and that whatever their feet touched the ground, the grass withered and died, never to grow again. Impossible maybe so, but look around, look for a hidden spot where no grass grows. Now, it is clearly purposeful that this little sign is meant to evoke the classic imagery of your Halloween witch. You know, the type that boils a potion in a cauldron and rides a broomstick, perhaps with green skin and such. But the most fun thing about this place isn't just this tale, it's the fact that it has an extremely interesting history and legend attached to it that's tied to supposed true events. Now, to start, there's a Native American lore aspect here. Back in the day, around the time of the Romans, folks of the Hopewell culture and afterwards their descendants, the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, would dwell here. It's said that around this time they escaped to this area from very bad straits in Mexico, and while doing this, they brought bones of their ancestors with them. On their quest towards this place, their leader apparently brought a medicine stick, and every night at camp the leader would plant it in the ground. In the morning, they'd see what direction the stick was leaning, and they'd go that direction it supposedly pointed. Along this way, a white dog accompanied them, leading them to food and water. Eventually, one night they awoke and the stick no longer leaned. It stood straight up. They had apparently arrived at their destination. And here they would establish a community and bury the bones of their ancestors. From there, this story evolves into two brothers that were there in this group, forming the Chickasaw and Choctaw tribes. And the tribes that tell these tales are also responsible for many of the nearby Native American mounds, which are also somewhat wrapped up in this. Now, because of all of this wrapped up into a nice tiny bow, it's said that because of the pre-existing Native American superstition here, that witches historically would gather at this place and perform what is referred to as a witch dance, a nighttime ceremony where they celebrated and honed their magic while feasting and dancing. And the story goes that wherever their bare feet touched, the ground would never again be fertile. Apparently after this, all native peoples began to avoid this land, and they would never approach the barren spot. It was even known to travelers and traders among the historic Natchez Trace. And here's where it ties into today. Today, still for whatever reason, this scorched or infertile spot of land remains, and folks continue to look at it and tell stories of superstition about it. It's said that, of course, this ground was made this way by witches, and if you know what's good for you, you'll avoid it because if you step upon this land, well, they'll know. And a little bit of that bad juju may just stick to you if you know what I mean. So if you've been with this channel for a while, like since before I had 200 subscribers, you'll remember me telling this tale, the story of Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson is one of the more influential and most mysterious figures in American music history. Born on May 8th of 1911 in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, Johnson came of age in the heart of the Delta, where the blues was more than just music, it was a way of life. His early years were marked by hardship and instability. His mother, Julia Dodds, moved frequently, and Robert bounced between homes and identities, even adopting his stepfather's last name, Spencer, for a time. But by his late teens, he'd taken the name Robert Johnson and begun to chase a dream to become a bluesman. At first, though, Johnson wasn't exactly a prodigy. According to stories from other musicians of the era, he was an enthusiastic but unremarkable guitar player, who often annoyed rather than impressed, but that all changed seemingly overnight. After a short disappearance from the local music scene, Johnson returned with astonishing skill. So much so that even seasoned bluesmen were floored by his transformation. Johnson's talent took him far beyond juke joints and street corners. In 1936 and 1937, he recorded a total of 29 songs across just 2 sessions. First in San Antonio, Texas, and then in Dallas. Those tracks would go on to define not only his legacy, but the very foundation of modern blues and rock and roll. Songs like Crossroad Blues, Hellhound on My Trail, Love in Vain, and Sweet Home Chicago became the cornerstones of American musical canon. His haunting voice, masterful guitar work, and deeply evocative lyrics spoke of sorrow, longing, and a life lived in the margins. But it wasn't just Johnson's music that captured imaginations, it was the mystery surrounding it. How did he learn to play so well so quickly? How could someone so young and so unknown produce such powerful, mature work in such a short span of time? And that's where the legend begins. If you haven't already caught the drift, Mr. Johnson's rapid success and song titles have led to a semi-conspiracy that the artist may have sold his soul to the devil in exchange for musical mastery. Where it's said that this deal took place changes from story to story, but the most common account is that it took place in Rosedale, Mississippi, due largely to the accounts of bluesman Henry Goodman, who claims that he saw this deal take place in a vision as he was traveling through the city of Rosedale. Rosedale was also briefly mentioned in one of Mr. Johnson's favorite songs, Traveling Riverside Blues. Now again, this legend is a bit dubious, owing to the fact that the only proper account of the event comes from a song by Henry Goodman. To summarize these events, in short, the tune tells a tale of a disheveled and down-on-his-luck Robert Johnson, who's feeling lonely and craving a sip of whiskey, walking down a country road. He passes by a dog on the left side of the road with a man. The man, sitting off to the side of the road, beckons Mr. Johnson, letting him know that he's late to something, and gives him an offer. Do you want to be like all the other guitar players, or do you want to play guitar like nobody has ever played it before? Of course, in response to this, Mr. Johnson quickly realizes that the dog he walked by isn't a dog at all, it's actually a hellhound. And Johnson was met with the proposition that he can have all of the beautiful blues talent in the world. He didn't even need to say yes to get it either. All he needed to do was take one single step towards Rosedale. But if he takes this step, there will be consequences. Well, Robert thinks about it for a second, and he takes this step. And the devil himself crowned him the king of Delta blues. Of course, this is just folklore, right? Johnson certainly would have a long, healthy life, right? Right? Well, not quite. While his life and rise to fame was certainly legendary, just as quickly as he rose to fame, he'd also vanish. He died on August 16th of 1938, at just 27 years old in a small rural area near Greenwood, Mississippi. The exact circumstances of his death remain clouded in uncertainty and speculation, fitting perhaps for a man whose life was already steeped in mystery. The most widely accepted account is that he was poisoned. According to those close to him, Johnson had been playing at a juke joint and was seeing a woman who was already romantically involved with the bar owner. One night, he was handed an open bottle of whiskey, something that fellow musician Sonny Boy Williamson reportedly warned him not to drink. Johnson took it anyways and took a drink. Soon after, he became violently ill and passed away after days of suffering. Most say it was a slow-acting poison designed not to take him immediately, but to make him suffer. No doctor was present, no autopsy was performed, and his exact burial site remains disputed to this day. But the mystery doesn't end here. Johnson's death at the age of 27 places him among the first members of what would be later dubbed the 27 Club, a group of iconic musicians who died at that same young age under tragic or mysterious circumstances. And for many, his sudden, painful death seems like the fulfillment of that infamous deal at the Crossroads, a deal that some of these other club members also perhaps took. After all, a deal with the devil always comes due. So with that story in mind, the question remains, did Johnson truly sell his soul for his otherworldly talent, or was he simply a gifted artist whose life was cut short by very human jealousy and betrayal? We may never know for certain, but like the echoes of his slide guitar, the legend of Robert Johnson continues to haunt the crossroads of American music and myth. Folks, quick interjection by me to say that these videos will always be free and on YouTube, but if you want to support the channel, I've added a Buy Me a Coffee link down below in the description if you ever feel like giving me a tip. 100% no pressure, and that's it. Back to the video. Did you know that Mississippi is home to the only known nuclear explosions east of the Rocky Mountains? Well, I didn't either, but as strange as that sounds, I'd much rather it be this way than the near-miss nuclear accidents that occurred in the Carolinas. If you're interested, check out some of those videos on that topic after this one. As we all probably know from watching Oppenheimer a few years ago, the first ever nuclear test took place during World War II in the remote New Mexico desert on July 16th of 1945. Shortly after this, nuclear warheads were dropped in Japan. Following World War II, the Cold War began, and in its aftermath, tens of thousands of nuclear warheads were built by both the USA and the Soviet Union. Along with these new weapons came the need for new testing methods, and as you might expect, people were eager to test their theories. However, above-ground nuclear testing has significant consequences. Radioactive particles eventually fall back to Earth, causing harmful health effects. This led to the USA, the UK, and the Soviet Union signing a treaty in 1963 that banned atmospheric and underwater nuclear tests. But the USA threw in a loophole. The treaty didn't say anything about underground tests. See, experts didn't think that underground tests should be banned either, fearing some countries might just cheat since they'd be harder to detect. To answer the question of whether underground nuclear tests could be detected, the USA decided to find out by launching Project Dribble. Project Dribble wasn't just a typical nuclear test. It was a test designed to test whether underground nuclear detonations could be detected. A test within a test, if you will, kind of like testception. For the experiment, a site was chosen north of Baxterville, Mississippi, where there was a large deposit of salt about 1,000 feet underground, the remnants of an ancient Mesozoic-era sea. The plan was to drill about 2,700 feet into the salt, detonate a warhead, create a large cavity, and then detonate a second large warhead in the cavity. The hypothesis was that the first warhead detonated in a tight space, and this would displace a lot of mass and create easily detectable seismic waves. The second detonation in the larger cavity would be less detectable, they thought. So on October 22nd, when the wind directions were favorable for the test, the military evacuated nearby residents, compensating them for their trouble. Then they set off their first warhead. The shockwaves were far more intense than expected. People as far as 30 miles away reported that buildings were swaying, and nearby creeks vibrated, and the water turned black with silt. Residents near the test site found that their well water had gone dry, and some homes even experienced structural damage with foundations cracking. While the government did compensate the residents fairly quickly, interviews later revealed that the local population didn't really get a say in whether these tests took place, a sad but common reality in the face of such projects. That wasn't the end of this experiment, though. The second warhead was detonated on December 3rd of 1966. As anticipated, this blast had much less severe effects. People just a few miles away hardly felt anything. The experiment had succeeded, and their hypotheses were correct. The USA proved that a nuclear detonation in a large underground cavity would dampen seismic waves enough to make it harder to detect. This meant that future countries could potentially cheat on nuclear testing bans if they kept the blast small enough and underground in a large cavity. Some speculate, though, that the US government learned valuable information, though, about how to detect such hidden tests, but that's something we'll likely never really know for sure. Regardless, by the end of 1966, this site's role had largely concluded. There were a few more tests using conventional explosives in the cavity, but since then the focus has shifted. Today, global nuclear stockpiles are slowly decreasing, and the USA hasn't conducted any nuclear tests since 1992. Other countries, except for one in Asia that is pretty notable, have largely refrained from testing for many years too. Most of the radioactive material from the test site here in Mississippi was left in the cavity, where it remains today. Perhaps the most striking feature at the site now is a large stone monument, warning future generations, do not dig or drill in this area, as the ground is still very much contaminated with radioactive material. And like any other nuclear test site, there are also concerns about its long-term health effects. Some locals have reported higher than average cancer rates, for instance, and the government has paid compensation to former employees of Project Dribble for health issues linked to their work. But despite this, the government maintains there's no significant health risk posed by the former test site. Alright, I've got 3 words for you. Perpetual, motion, machine. Well, sort of at least. See, in the woods of Loosedale, Mississippi, in what could aptly be described as the middle of nowhere, there was a man named Joseph Wesley Newman. He was a man with ambition, to say the least, and this man laid claim to an idea that spurred an invention that, according to him, could solve essentially every problem in the world. Water, he could pump it to you. Hot? Well, he can cleanly provide you air conditioning. This is only to name a couple of ways his supposed invention might save the world. Now, as for Newman, he dropped out of high school at 15 and joined the Army. He'd worked in oil fields, and he got a degree in accounting and economics. And after going through several jobs, he decided he'd be an inventor. You'll see this in a minute, but his invention requires a whole bunch of knowledge regarding how physics works. But the thing is, he claims because he was not formally educated in physics, he's free to challenge questions without the constraints of traditional physicists. That's definitely an interesting take. Let's see how it goes. So I've seen it described that his invention came in 3 forms. One that's the size of a fire hydrant, another more akin to a hot tub, and then there's a larger version that weighs about 5,000 pounds. According to him, these inventions produce more energy than they consume. Again, sort of. Now, as for how this thing works, apparently this thing works by hooking up the electrical leads, which causes an internal magnet that's wrapped in copper, whose atoms supposedly align to rotate about 150 times per minute. This takes a 4.5-inch pulley with a belt and lead weights that acts like a dynamometer, so that torque is produced, and this would create an electromagnetic field. If you buy the story, at least according to Newman and a few others, Newman's device was producing more energy than it consumed. Apparently, however it was doing this, the device was made of components any old person could purchase, and this plays into part of Newman's claims, that he essentially invented a Home Depot-style perpetual motion machine that, if adopted, could revolutionize the world. He even claimed at the time of one article I'm reading that he expected the device to power a car within 6 months. So where's that car, Joe? I'm still seeing Teslas driving around. Anyways, Gerald Miller, an engineering consultant in California, apparently tested and inspected the device, and described it as, except for a cylindrical magnet that rotates when the box is hooked up, the device is enclosed in a plywood box. A bank of batteries hooked up in series powers it, and a lead comes back out to the batteries from the output side of the machine. We attached both an oscilloscope and a multimeter to gauge both voltage and amperage, and measured electrical current flowing both ways. Newman also posits that the fundamental building block of all matter is, okay, this is ridiculous, a gyroscopic particle, an infinitesimal unit of matter that spins like a gyroscope. Certainly not anything they've discovered with the Large Hadron Collider recently. He also posits that this device is harnessing Einstein's old E=mc² equation, and is actually converting matter into energy. In short, it is these gyroscopic particles that, for lack of a better word, maybe make-believe, are creating energy when they supposedly collide, causing the magnetic field this thing is generating to expand and collapse. Of course, time and time again, if you read documents pertaining to the saga, Newman claims the government is trying to hide his invention from the world for the betterment of big oil and gas, and that the government is lying when they say the invention he's touting is literally impossible, even though it very well may be. Newman, in pursuit of advertising his invention, took his invention all over the country, displaying it and inviting physicists to debate him, although nobody ever showed up. This being said, there are a few notable individuals who have looked at his work and said it's legit. For instance, Dr. Roger Hastings, who works for the Sperry Univac Corporation, believed him, running tests on the invention and claiming that Newman's device put out 10 times more energy than went into it, and that personally he couldn't find any way that it was secretly generating energy. Also, Milton Everett, an energy specialist with the Mississippi Department of Energy in Jackson, was apparently convinced. Of course, you knew this saga was going to get juicy. Newman in March of 1979 would apply for a patent for this, but would of course be denied because the patent office doesn't screw around with perpetual motion machines, period. He'd file a suit against the patent office because of this. Admittedly, some people, even a special master William Schuyler Jr., a former U.S. Patent Office commissioner who was appointed to evaluate the machine during the suit, claimed the machine worked. Despite this, the patent office refused to file the patent. Then in 1985, a federal judge overseeing the case had Newman turn his machine over to the government for testing. I should note, Newman and his representatives were not allowed to attend these tests. That being said, despite taking ownership of it, at least by the claim of Newman, it hadn't been tested. and Newman would refuse to recover his machine until they tested it. He was devoted to it. He said, "I've spent 21 years working on this machine and 7 trying to get it patented. I am devoted to this." Thus, the machine was just impounded. Now, contrary to Newman's claim, the National Bureau of Standards and Technology claimed that it actually did perform 2 months of testing, during which the machine used more energy than it created. According to them, in short, it was a quack, a made-up invention that didn't do what Newman advertised. Newman, of course, did not accept these results, and called it, amongst other things, an injustice. He wouldn't ever end up collecting his machine because of this. By some accounts, actually, Newman legitimately prepared and publicly gave a statement in opposition to the Patent Office's findings, before they even released their findings because he knew they'd be denying his invention's credence. Apparently following this saga, Newman wrote a book, literally giving away the so-called secret of his machine. The book is named Joseph Newman's Revolutionary Energy Machine. Very humble of him. This book apparently details the theory behind his machine and claims that anyone can build it. Honestly, God, I wonder if I should try building it. YouTubers have done dumber things. Newman claims this idea is a threat to the global financial structure and believes the conspiracy to hold him down went all the way to the president. Gonna hit you with a fat LOL on that one, bud. Despite this, he's written to every president since Lyndon Johnson about this technology, but hasn't received a response, likely because the President of the United States, regardless of any argument about their incompetency, is usually too busy hatching some plan that is seemingly evil or useless to write back to one of their constituents. Don't get me wrong, I'm very pro-renewable energy, and I bet you anything that the oil companies want to be at the front of the charge when renewables are eventually accepted. But personally, I'm not sold on this sort of machine existing. And while I absolutely agree that the government probably lies whenever it has the chance, I also believe in and have yet to see an exception to the second law of thermodynamics. In the sleepy countryside near Columbus, Mississippi, there's a stretch of dirt road that locals have come to fear and, oddly enough, sometimes seek out. That road? Nash Road. It's a lonely stretch of nowhere, dusty, quiet, and shadowed by thick woods on either side. But it's not just the isolation that makes this place eerie. No, it's something far stranger. Some call her the three-legged lady. Personally, I've liked referring to her as Three-Legged Susan, and honestly, I'm not quite sure if she's a cryptid or a ghost, but from the reports I'm reading, your hands won't just pass through her if you touch her, so we're gonna go with cryptid. Regardless, it's said that if you're lucky enough to drive down this infamous stretch between 2661 and 4548 Nash Road at night, you might just see her. Legend has it that when your headlights shine too brightly on her turf, you'll see her bolting from the woods. That's right, a woman emerges from the trees, her extra legs a twisted, terrifying testament to something unnatural. And she chases you. She runs after your car faster than you can accelerate. And if you're really lucky, she slams into the side of your vehicle like a deranged emu on a caffeine binge. She might even race you to the end of the road. And the rules of engagement, as the legend goes, are simple and classic spooky story fare, but also a little bit stupid. First, you have to park your car in the middle of nowhere, on a unlit dirt road. Then, turn off your headlights, which I cannot recommend you ever do in the middle of a road. Then for the grand finale, you honk your horn 3 times, just like with every other urban legend in existence. I know, you're probably thinking, why would anyone do that? Well, if you're one of those thrill-seeking teenagers, or a local curious enough to chase a ghost story for kicks, the thought of a three-legged lady knocking on your car roof is apparently too good to pass up. If you're lucky, or cursed, depending on how you see it, she might come up to your window, knock once, then race you to the end of the road. Some say she even tries to claw her way inside. But how did she get this way? Where did this three-legged nightmare come from? That's where the story gets even weirder, and also very variable. Some versions of the tale suggest a woman was dismembered and discarded in the woods near Nash Road, and I suppose her remains either rose from the ashes as this creature, or she's a strange ghost that is somehow also material. Regardless, as for this tale, from my research there have never been any remains found in the area, at least not documented ones. Then there's another darker version that has to do with a missing woman. According to this one, a mother's worst nightmare came true when her daughter vanished without a trace along Nash Road. The woman, however, was certain that her child would be found there, and she combed the road desperately, but all she found was one of her daughter's legs. Disturbingly, she didn't bury this leg or anything. Nope, she didn't even scream. Instead, she did what any completely rational person would do. She carried the leg up and down the road with her, as if that would somehow bring her daughter back. But carrying a leg through the woods can do strange things to the mind, and over time the woman began to go mad, walking the road for hours each day. And then, well, she started to change, and she began chasing motorists down the road, believing them to possibly be the ones responsible for her daughter's disappearance. Then there's the really weird one, a story that ties the three-legged lady to an abandoned church near Nash Road. Legend says that the church, which has long since fallen into disrepair and nowadays I think might just be torn down, became the meeting ground for a satanic cult after its abandonment. They didn't just hold creepy ceremonies in the dark. No, these rituals were about summoning things that should never be summoned. And some say that during one of these rituals, the cult accidentally called forth the three-legged lady, a demon or spirit bound by the cult's dark magic. The details are murky, but the result was the same. An unnatural woman with a twisted body and rage that could only be quenched by chasing after the living. If you think this story can't get any stranger, there's one more variation that involves a mother, her toddler, and a dog that starts with the dog barking at a barn in the middle of the night. So like any good mother, she heads out to investigate. The thing is, though, when she returns, her child was gone. Poof, vanished. But then there's something on the floor. A child's leg. Now, rather than, freaking calling the authorities, this mom's first instinct is to attach the leg to her body. Yeah, she actually tried to graft it onto herself, believing it would somehow keep her child alive. Needless to say, things didn't go well. Over time, the woman grew more and more unstable. People claimed she went mad, probably from some weird disease she caught from the leg, maybe rabies, maybe something else. Eventually, the leg grew, and so did she. And that's when she became the three-legged woman. So anyways, look, I get it. This whole story sounds a little absurd. A woman with a severed leg grafted onto her, a ghost or something chasing cars on a dusty road. It's ridiculous. And yet for some reason, people keep telling the story. They tell it over campfires, they tell it on the internet, in dark corners of forums, and they apparently also tell it locally. For whatever reason, this legend just won't die, and thus the legend of the three-legged woman persists to this day. Anyways, next time I'm in Mississippi, I'll be sure to pay Nash Road a visit to test out this urban legend. But in the meantime, if you're ever in the area, and you're feeling particularly brave, drive down to Nash Road. But remember, turn your headlights off, park, honk 3 times, and then hope you don't meet the three-legged lady, because once you do, it's no longer a legend, it's real. Mississippi, I had a heck of a time here with you, and man, I'm almost sad to say that I've only got a few more states to cover in the whole southeastern USA. Regardless, if you want more stories for your state, or just more of this series in general, drop a comment below and let me know what you want to see next. And hey, if you enjoyed the ride, hitting like and subscribing helps me get one step closer to my goal of 100,000 subs in 2025. Seriously, it's free, it's quick, and it lets YouTube know that this is the kind of content you'd like to see more of. Now, as for what's next, I've heard there are Razorbacks in the region, and they enjoy folklore, if you catch my drift. Arkansas, we're coming for you. After that, though, I'm going to make my triumphant return possibly to the first state we've ever covered on this channel, Alabama. Or I might do a Dark Places episode on the Florida Everglades. Let me know what you want to see. Also, man, that one had better be a banger. It's practically my channel's anniversary, so once I hit Alabama, I'd better do good. Now, regardless of what the order of states is, remember, most importantly, whether you just felt the ground start shaking near Baxterville, or if you plugged your extension cord into itself for limitless power, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.